Geographers, welcome to the Middle East, North Africa, Southwest Asia. There's really no good descriptive single name for this area, so I'll go through that in just a second, but it's one of those areas we kind of know what we're talking about, even though it may not be the appropriate name for it, because we're stretching all the way from Western Sahara on the Atlantic coast of Northern Africa, across North Africa, through Saudi Arabia, the Persian Gulf countries, and into Afghanistan. So we're covering a relatively broad area when we talk about this. There's going to be lots of things that tie it together, and then lots of things that give us a lot of diversity within the region. It's an important region, though. We've got some, important cultural crossroads, the origins of humanity, major cities in this area. We've got choke points that are key for the movement of goods, whether it's for trade or during military times, like the Strait of Gibraltar, the Suez Canal. All of those become important in moving goods and controlling those in the power associated with that. This is also where we've had three major world religions originate, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. But one of the cultural aspects of it that we often associate with this region is conflict. And so we'll try and address and see if we can understand where some of that conflict comes from. Their physical environment, water is always an issue. No matter where you are, water is an issue. It's not to say everybody's a desert, but there are some areas that have a Mediterranean climate, like we have in California, and we all know that water is even an issue in Mediterranean climates. And then oil. Oil is found not in every country, but kind of sprinkled throughout the area. And we'll see how that plays a major role in some of the geography we see today. Cultural crossroads. I'll move on from that. Our choke points, I already mentioned these. The Suez Canal, when we talk about Egypt, I'll talk more about the Suez Canal. It's an amazing shortcut. You don't have to go all the way around Africa to ship goods from Europe to and from Asia. And then, of course, the origins of first Judaism, then Christianity, then Islam. So I almost feel like I'm telling you something that's not going to be on the test, because it's so hard to define what a good name is for this region. And yes, there are some textbooks that refer to this as the dry world, which is just really absurd because, yeah, it is dry, but not that dry. So I'll go through these that, yeah, you've got the deserts dominate the landscape, but that's not the only thing there. And for the most part, the populations don't live in those desert areas. Obviously, there's going to be some exceptions, but this is an extremely sparsely populated region in through here, and the interior in through here. You'd think all of Egypt, because it shows up as a desert. Well, Egypt is a major world population center because of the Nile River. So again, water becomes important. And again, the Mediterranean climates, that darker brown you see. And for those of you who had physical geography, you're going to love the climate types because it's B climate dominant. And if you've never seen a desert, look, there's another desert. But here in the Mediterranean climate, you're going to see tree crops, just like you see in California. Well, Arab has been kind of a Western term, a general generic term for this area, which is totally incorrect, because really, ethnically, there's only one Arab ethnic group, and they're in the Arabian Peninsula, and even at that, there's some diversity within that. Sometimes it's in reference to the language, because Arabic is the dominant language, but there's other major countries that have a significant population who don't speak Arabic. So this has been perpetuated in the United States. My dad would always call anybody from this area an Arab, and as in college, trying to correct him that there is kind of a big difference between a Persian and an Arab, but that time has passed. And even that, as far as to give you an idea of the diversity within the area, you can see that ethnic Arabs often spill over, that what a weird use of terms, are found beyond the borders of Saudi Arabia. There, that's better. And even within the Arab group, you've got Sunni and Shiite Muslims in the Arab ethnicity. And then we'll come back and talk more about the Kurds too, and they're spilling over into multiple countries. Also, this is where you find the majority of the world's Muslims, and so calling it an Islamic realm, yeah, kinda. That religion dominates the area, but the practices within that area vary very, very much. And also, you've got the Shiite and Sunni Muslims within it, and you've got significant exceptions in some areas, and where you've got some Christian groups, some Jewish groups, some Orthodox. There's quite a variety depending on where you are. But as far as the religious aspect of it, this is the heart of three great religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, with a lot of overlap. They share narrative, they share prophets. There's variations, obviously, between them. There's variations, interpretations of the role of the monotheistic God. Judaism, it's the early narrative. And so this is what we'll find prophets and stories and locations from Judaism that are in Christianity and in Islam as well. It's, again, all of these are monotheistic, and traditional Judaism, it's had thousands of years to evolve, obviously, so they're going to see variations in all of three of these religions and variations in practices. But it's sometimes referred to as an ethnic group because it's something that you are born into, although that practice varies a lot as well. Now, the diaspora in AD 70, I'll come back to when I talk about Israel. But that was when we see the spread of the Jewish population outside of this area into cities throughout the Roman Empire. With Christianity, what's happening is that you're continuing a lot of the story and narrative from the Jewish tradition, but you're putting what I like to think of as like a new spin on things, and based on the teachings of Jesus and his disciples. What happens, though, in those early years is that you have multiple stories about Jesus and what Jesus is. Is he God? Is he the Son of God? Is he a man? And it's really not until the Council of Nicaea in 325 where they kind of establish this is what the teachings of Christianity are. There's still some remnant groups from those that are still following some of those early pathways of the teachings of Jesus. So you'll especially found it just locally in the Middle East. But that's where we kind of established the Bible that we see today with just the four Gospels instead of the other Gospels. And every now and then somebody will make a big deal about, oh, we found a lost Gospel. I'm like, we knew they existed. It was decided that they wouldn't be included in the Bible. And with that, that's when you establish that the concept of the Holy Trinity, where God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are one. And so that's why I'm bringing that up, is because that will be an issue in a little bit when we start talking about Islam. Now, Islam is the religion. A Muslim is a follower of it, and it's based on the teachings of Muhammad. And Muhammad was a trader, not trader. He traded goods about 1,400 years ago. And he had issues with Christianity. Now, where he was in what is now modern Saudi Arabia, he interacted with lots of different religions. It's thought that he had Jewish bookkeepers in his trading, but he had issues with Christianity because he didn't see Jesus as being God. He saw Jesus as being a person who did the teachings of God. So he was a prophet, not the Son of God. And so that was an emphasis within what we'll see within Islam, is there's but one God, Allah. And there's also, one could argue that the saints within Catholicism also might represent, since they have magical powers, that they have godlike powers as well. So maybe there's more than one God. And so that's kind of where this comes from. And this is kind of hard because I was brought up Catholic, and that's not how it's taught. But if you're an outsider, that's sometimes how it can be seen and perceived. So there's a rejection of the Holy Trinity and the idea of the saints. And also, he was seeing how women were treated as sexual objects. He was in a city. There was lots of prostitutes there. And so some of the teachings within the Quran is the equality of women. Now, we'll see how this gets interpreted differently as Islam plays out throughout the Middle East. Also, there's kind of an objection to the unusual accumulation of wealth by some at the expense of the poor. And so that's why in the teachings of Islam is that you're supposed to help the poor. Now, this too, we see different interpretations of this, because if you've ever been to Saudi Arabia and the ostentatious displays of wealth, well, that's a Wahhabism, that's a practice of Islam that varies from some of the other ones. And I'll have pictures in just a second from Morocco where there are kind of a downplaying of the wealth. So I'll get to the 5 pillars of faith. So Muhammad dies, and you end up with 2 different groups kind of splitting off. It's similar in practices, but there's different interpretations of the Quran. Usually when you see Sunni and Shiites fighting, it's not about religion, just like the Protestants and Catholics weren't fighting about religion in Northern Ireland. It's who was in control of the government, who's in control of the cities, the sources of wealth, and kind of the inequalities, but they're not about religious differences. So the 5 pillars of faith, obviously I'm not going to ask you to memorize these. That's why you'll see them in gray. That there's the single God. This is that emphasis on monotheism, 5 times a day praying. You've got the month of fasting, giving of alms to the poor, and if one's able to make it to Mecca for a pilgrimage once in your life. Now, here's the other thing that makes Islam very different than kind of the modern evolutions we've seen of Christianity in the Americas and in Europe, that often Islam and its teachings are more than just religious teachings. They're also how to run a society. So it becomes integrated into the government. And so you'll have major religious roles within the government itself. That's, we go out of our way in the United States for the separation of church and state. And then even in European countries where there's an official church, the church, the Lutheran church in Norway, for example, but they don't really have a say in how the government is run. And that's different in these areas. And this too varies. You'll have some that used to go out of their way to be secular, Turkey, and then others where the religious leaders pretty much have the major say in how the government is run, such as what we see in Iran today. So there's this, it's just not that uncommon to find major religious players within the government. Also the culture, because some of the teachings relate to your way of life, the cultural aspects, your day-to-day life, or what it means to be these different ethnic groups, you'll see Islam integrated with that. And this is where we see a lot of the variation, and like with the role of women. And so if women were second-class citizens within culture, Islam would be integrated into that as well. Where like in Saudi Arabia, where women can't drive cars, or the governments where you can't have women in the government seats. So all the women are equal. They're just don't have the same rights that the men do in some of these cultures. So when we have a conflict in this area, the easiest one is Afghanistan, where we were fighting against the Taliban, and the American population is like, well, but this has nothing to do with Islam. This is about the government of Afghanistan hiding Osama bin Laden. And to the region, they're the same thing. They're intertwined. And so by attacking the government, you're also attacking the religion. Now, what we end up seeing in the 1970s is kind of a pushback against foreign intervention in the region. And what brings people together and what unifies them is these strict religious groups, ultra conservative, of like, this is what makes us who we are, and this is unique to us. This is how we're different than the West. And by playing upon that, they would get followers to reject Western intervention. So that's why you end up with the overthrow of the government in Iran in 1979, and it's associated with being anti-American because the Americans were supporting the government. And so as long as you rally your people around, let's get the Americans out of here, it becomes kind of this far-right religious group. We don't have it that extreme in the United States. There are some far-right religious groups that will rally the people together, but not nearly to the extreme because we don't have it as integrated, and we're so diverse in the United States that it's difficult for something like that to really, really take hold on such a large scale. The spread of Islam, remember, this was during the Dark Ages for Europe, so a lot of the trade through the area went through the Middle East. These were the major traders of the period of time, and so where they went, they took their religion with them. There was also some wars that were fought where we see the spread of Islam. different practices within it and variations. This is the covering of the head, or sometimes the covering of the face with the burqa, shador, and hijab, that are seen as a sign of respect before God. And some also would argue that it's a desexualization of the women. But it's, for my grandmother, for example, the Catholic Church, when you go into a Catholic church, she always had to wear a scarf on her head. And that was her symbol of humility before God. And only Catholics who've been around for a while remember that in the 1960s, this was before I was involved, they got rid of that rule. But my grandma, until the 1980s, she still, as soon as she walked into church, she put that scarf on her head. Role of women in government, lots of variations in here. Where some governments where they're not allowed to be involved, where they're discouraged from being involved, and then where some of these they actually establish specific seats for women in the government. And look at us. We kind of stink at this as well. We're going to see one of these countries that had a female president before we did. Now this is in Morocco. And this is a common street scene where you've got the buildings with the doorways along the way, where they'll share internal walls between two different households. You don't know how big these are because this is a relatively large building. Does this enter into a single room, or does it enter into a giant courtyard behind it? When we were there, it was always curious because you didn't know what you were going to see. And there was a couple places, one they were doing construction, actually both of them they were doing construction, where the door opened into this hallway that opened to a giant courtyard, and it was spectacular and huge. The other one that was open was literally as wide as the doors and about 20 feet deep. And in it was a bed, a stove, and a bathroom. But that was it. That was the entire, whatever you want to call it. But from the outside, you wouldn't know. And so that's the no ostentatious displays of wealth. Now the Hajj to Mecca, the pilgrimage, this is a story into itself. There's rituals that are followed to repeat things that Muhammad did and Abraham had done. And it's become a massive, massive event with literally millions of people showing up, except in 2020 because of the coronavirus. So this is, I mean, you've got walkways that are designed like freeways, but this is for pedestrian traffic. At one point, you're supposed to throw rocks to drive away the devil, and so these stones represent the devil. And so this is for pedestrian traffic that ends up looking like this. And trust me, you don't want to be in this front row. I already mentioned this, the fundamentalists, the anti-Western, the anti-imperialism of the time. I'll keep talking about this because it shows up over and over again where either the Russians have been, the Soviet Union was involved, the Americans were involved, Europeans were involved in the politics of this area in the 1950s, 1960s, all the way up until the present day. And the one thing that we all wanted out of this area is the oil. And we would favor governments that would sell us oil. Oppressive or not, we didn't care. We just wanted a government in power that would sell us oil. So obviously, Islam dominates the area, with Sunni being the largest population. In Orange County, we have a significant Shiite population, and that's from the large number of Persians, Iranians who left after the revolution and resettled in Orange County. Notice too, you've got the Jewish state with Israel, you've got a Christian population in South Sudan. So again, Islam dominates, but it's not the only player. Now, if I was going to talk about the Spanish colonial city and its design, I'm going to talk about the Middle Eastern city as well. The city center would be where you would find the mosque. This is where the call to prayers come from. It doesn't have exactly the same role as, say, like a major cathedral in Europe, but it plays like this as its role as the center of religion for that area. And then the souk would be, or bazaar, depending on what city you're in, is the shopping area. And they're just like in the Spanish colonial city where you had that central square. That central square was typically used as a marketplace as well. Often they're this kind of chaotic hodgepodge of streets, pedestrian traffic. The souk shops are grouped together, so you'd find the food shops together, the fabric shop next to the shirt shop, and this particular one That's about the size of most of the shops we'd seen in Morocco. They're very active. You can find some of these remnants of this in Spain because of the influence of the Moors when they occupied the area. I always think of them as like these really big strip malls with little tiny stores in them. And then this would be the carpet row of the souk. So we're going to start going into some of the areas. We're going to start in this area, move across North Africa, then move back into this direction as we go through the area. Post-World War I becomes important in some of the things that are happening today because the Ottoman Empire was broken up and you had the French, British, and Spanish, the French and British in this area, the Spanish involved over here, the Italians sticking their nose in over here, and because of that, we see some of the boundaries are somewhat artificial. For example, what becomes Iraq and Kuwait, this is carved out by the British because they were trying to control the amount of oil that the Europeans were going to take out of the area. So the thought was that, you're going to have a limit per country you can take out. So the English helped create a second country out of this region, and that's when they carved out this little Kuwait. This becomes important later in the first Iraq War because they were claiming that this should have been part of Iraq going back to 1920. And then also the other one that we'll talk about is Palestine. This is British Palestine, where they administered this entire area despite the fact that it had two distinctive ethnic groups in there. It had the Jewish population and the Palestinian population in that same area. Now, a decade ago, we went through the Arab Spring, and don't worry about the details of this. This is more of a general concept that I want you to get, and I'll come to that in a second. But there was this rebellion against the strong governments, the corrupt governments, where you had the money that was coming in for oil was educating the population, but there wasn't enough jobs for everybody. And the secret police were controlling everything that was going on, watching the people, and if you were thought to be subversive, you were thrown in jail. Egypt was under martial law for decades, just so that Mubarak could stay in power and in control. And so finally what had happened to the population was like, you know what, this is so bad, I don't care what you do to me. They kind of lost the fear of the government. And once the secret police couldn't intimidate the population, we saw the governments shake up. So we saw lots of changes, including governments completely overthrown, such as in Egypt and Libya. Others where it just kind of disrupted things a lot, like Syria. Everybody was able to communicate with each other relatively quickly with all this online social media. And so Mubarak, the president of Egypt, when he was ousted, one of the descriptions was he was Facebooked. Also here, when you had so much unrest throughout a huge area and countries being overthrown, it depended on the military's reaction, what happened within the government. So in the United States, our commander-in-chief, our president, is in charge of the military, so they do what he says. In other countries, they're kind of separate, where Mubarak in Egypt, he had his own secret police, and then there was also the Egyptian military. And the Egyptian military was stable, well-organized. They kind of stepped back, let Mubarak get overthrown, and then they step back in. All of this happened, and it's similar to like Africa in the 50s and 60s when they overthrew the colonizers because they'd had enough, Eastern Europe in the 1990s when they'd had enough of communism, and so in this area they just had enough of the authoritarian governments. So the general gist of this is we saw kind of a fundamental shift in the area about 9-10 years ago, and it kind of left a power vacuum. So that's where ISIS came from. That's why Syria is a mess. That's why Libya is a mess right now because of the aftermath of overthrowing a government. But in other countries, it's gone very well. So here are the ones that were affected by that. So with ISIS, every now and then you'll hear it. A few years ago, this was, the threat of ISIS taking over the world. The idea of ISIS was that you'd create this really strict fundamentalist Islamic state. And it was drawing in hardcore Sunnis from around the world with this shared goal. Now, they seized territory in Syria, but they lost most of that. There's remnants of them sprinkled around in Syria and in Libya as well. But this was what their goal was. And even the countries that had really strict Sunni governments, they didn't even want them around. And this is the outflow from multiple countries into Syria. All right, in part 2, we'll start going through some of the countries and regions within this Middle East, North Africa, whatever the heck we decided we were going to call it.